Hey everyone. I never thought I'd be the one to post in this section. I've read countless stories about strange encounters, supernatural events, and the downright terrifying, but I always figured I was just here for the entertainment. Maybe a little part of me believed in the paranormal, but I certainly wasn't looking for it. After what happened a few nights ago, though, I'm convinced something is out there, something that we don't fully understand, and something we definitely don't want to invite into our lives. This is my story. Believe it or not, it's up to you, but I had to share it. Maybe writing it down will help me process it, or maybe it's just to warn others. Either way, here it goes. A few nights ago, I was staying alone at my uncle's cabin. It's a small place tucked away in the woods about 30 miles outside of the nearest town. No neighbors, no streetlights, and only the occasional sounds of wildlife to break the silence. I've stayed there before and never had any issues, though I've always found it a little eerie. The remoteness is part of the charm, I suppose. I arrived in the early evening, and by the time I got settled, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The cabin has this old wood stove, so I lit a fire, made some tea, and settled in for what I thought would be a peaceful night of reading and maybe a little stargazing. The night was clear, and the stars out there are incredible, nothing like what you see in the city. Around 10 p.m., I decided to step outside to take in the night air. The sky was pitch black, save for the thousands of stars twinkling above. The woods were silent except for the occasional rustle of leaves in the wind. It was one of those moments where you feel utterly alone, but not in a bad way. At least that's how I felt at first. After a few minutes, I started to get this strange feeling like I was being watched. I know how cliché that sounds, but I swear it was like something was out there in the darkness just beyond the reach of the porch light. I tried to shake it off, but the feeling wouldn't go away. It was almost like the air had changed, like there was an electricity to it that I couldn't explain. I decided to go back inside. I locked the door behind me, something I hadn't done earlier, and checked all the windows to make sure they were secure. It was weird. I've never felt the need to do that before, but something just didn't feel right. I tried to distract myself with my book, but I couldn't focus. Every little noise outside seemed amplified, and my eyes kept darting to the windows. I'm not sure how long I sat there pretending to read, but eventually I heard it. A knock at the door. At first, I wasn't sure I'd actually heard it. It was so faint, almost like a tap rather than a knock. I listened for a moment, but there was nothing. Just the crackling of the fire and the wind outside. Then it came again. This time there was no mistaking it. Someone, or something, was knocking on the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Knock, knock, knock. My heart started to race. Who the hell would be out here at this hour? There were no other cabins for miles, and even if someone had gotten lost, why wouldn't they call out for help instead of just knocking? I got up slowly and made my way to the door. I hesitated before looking through the peephole. Something deep down told me I wouldn't like what I saw. When I finally peered through, my breath caught in my throat. Standing on the porch, illuminated by the dim light from the porch lamp, were 2 children. A boy and a girl, both no older than 10 or 11. They were dressed in old-fashioned clothing like something out of the 1950s. Coats too big for their small frames, and hats that cast shadows over their faces. But that wasn't the strangest part. What really unsettled me was their eyes. Even through the peephole, I could tell something was off. Their eyes were dark, too dark. At first, I thought it was just the shadows, but as they looked up directly at the peephole, I saw it clearly. Their eyes were pitch black. No whites, no irises, just solid, black orbs staring back at me. I stumbled back from the door, my mind racing. What the hell was I looking at? I'd heard stories about black-eyed kids before, but I'd never believed them. They were just urban legends, right? But these kids, they were real. They were standing right outside my door. I stood there, frozen, unsure of what to do. Every instinct in my body was telling me not to open that door, not to let them in, but I felt this weird compulsion, like they were drawing me toward them. Then I heard the girl's voice. "Please let us in. We're lost and we need to call our parents." Her voice was flat, emotionless. It didn't sound right. I can't explain it, but there was something almost robotic about the way she spoke, like she was reciting a line she'd practiced 100 times. The boy didn't say anything, just stared at the door with those soulless black eyes. I took another step back, trying to shake off the feeling of dread that was creeping over me. I knew I shouldn't let them in. Every story I'd ever read about these things said the same thing: don't let them in. But still, that voice, it was like it was inside my head, urging me to open the door. "Please," she repeated, "let us in." My hand was trembling as I reached for the doorknob. I didn't want to open it, but it was like my body wasn't listening to my brain. I was terrified, but that fear seemed to dull in the presence of their voice, like it was pushing the fear aside. Just as my hand brushed the doorknob, the boy finally spoke. "We won't hurt you. We just need to come in." That snapped me out of whatever trance I was in. The way he said it, there was no emotion, no pleading. It was a statement, almost a command. My fear came flooding back and I stumbled back from the door, practically tripping over my own feet. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "You need to leave." There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought they might actually go. But then the girl spoke again. "Please," she said, her voice more insistent. "We're cold and we're scared. Just let us in. We need to use your phone." I didn't respond. I couldn't. I was too scared to even move. And that's when they started knocking again. This time it was louder, more insistent. The knocks were steady, rhythmic, 3 at a time like before. Knock, knock, knock. They didn't stop. The knocking just kept going, relentless, like they knew I was inside and they weren't going to leave until I opened the door. Knock, knock, knock. I wish I could say I was stronger, that I didn't give in to the mounting pressure in my head, but I was terrified, paralyzed by fear and something else, something I couldn't quite explain. I couldn't shake that voice in my mind, the one that kept telling me to open the door, to let them in. It was as if my rational thoughts were being overridden by this overwhelming compulsion. "Please," the girl's voice echoed again, softer this time, almost pleading. Before I knew it, my hand was on the doorknob again, and this time I turned it. The door creaked open just a crack, but that was all they needed. The girl pushed it open wider, and they both stepped inside without waiting for an invitation. They stood in the small entryway, the dim light from the fire casting long, eerie shadows across their faces. Up close, the blackness of their eyes was even more unsettling. It was like staring into 2 bottomless pits, completely devoid of emotion, humanity, or even life. The girl smiled, but it wasn't a smile that reached her eyes. It was more like a practiced gesture, something she had seen and was trying to mimic. The boy remained silent, his gaze locked on me as if he were studying me, reading every thought that crossed my mind. "We just need to make a call," the girl said, her voice still that flat, emotionless tone. "Our parents are probably worried about us." I nodded dumbly, unable to form any words. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't make myself move. They didn't wait for me to offer them a phone. Instead, they walked further into the cabin, their footsteps unnervingly quiet, almost as if they weren't touching the floor at all. They headed straight for the living room, where the fire was crackling warmly in the wood stove. I followed them, not sure what else to do. My brain was screaming at me that this was wrong, that I needed to get them out, but my body refused to obey. "Where's your phone?" the girl asked, turning to face me. Her expression was blank, devoid of any genuine concern or fear. I pointed to the landline on the table, my hand shaking. She walked over to it, picked up the receiver, and held it to her ear. She didn't dial any numbers, just held the phone up like she was listening to a dial tone. The boy, meanwhile, had taken a seat on the couch, his dark eyes fixed on the fire. "We can't get through," she said after a moment, placing the phone back on the table. "It must be the storm. Do you mind if we stay here until it passes?" I didn't know what to say. My mouth was dry, my throat constricted with fear. The storm had indeed picked up outside, the wind howling through the trees, but there hadn't been any rain, no lightning, just that oppressive, suffocating darkness. "Sure," I finally managed to croak out, my voice barely above a whisper. "You can stay." "Thank you," the girl replied, that same unnatural smile stretching across her face. The moment the words left my mouth, something in the room shifted. The warmth of the fire seemed to ebb away, replaced by a chilling cold that seeped into my bones. The air grew heavy, almost suffocating, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread wash over me. The kids didn't seem to notice, or if they did, they didn't care. They moved through the cabin like they owned the place, like they had been there before. The boy was still staring at the fire, but the girl had turned her attention to me, watching me with those empty black eyes. "Why don't you sit down?" she suggested, but it wasn't a suggestion. It was more of a command. I hesitated, but again that strange compulsion took over, and I found myself sinking into the armchair across from the couch. The room was silent except for the crackling of the fire and the occasional whistle of the wind outside. The girl didn't sit. She remained standing, her gaze locked on me. The boy finally looked away from the fire and turned his attention to me as well. The way they were staring, it was like they were waiting for something. "Are you alone here?" the girl asked suddenly, her voice breaking the silence like a knife. I hesitated, my mind racing. Should I lie? Tell them someone else was coming, that I wasn't alone? But somehow I knew that wouldn't matter. "Yes," I finally admitted, my voice trembling. "I'm alone." The girl exchanged a glance with the boy, and for a split second, I thought I saw something in her eyes, something dark and malicious, a glint of malevolence that sent a shiver down my spine. "You shouldn't have let us in," the boy finally spoke, his voice low and eerie. It was the first time I'd heard him speak, and the sound of it sent a wave of nausea through me. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. "Why?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The girl smiled again, but this time, it wasn't even trying to be friendly. It was a twisted, sinister grin, revealing teeth that seemed sharper than they should be. "Because now we're inside," she said, her voice dripping with something dark and ancient, something that didn't belong to a child. "And once we're inside, we don't leave." As she spoke, the light in the room seemed to dim, the shadows growing longer, deeper. The fire flickered, the warmth all but gone, replaced by a bone-chilling cold that seemed to radiate from the kids themselves. I tried to move, to get up, to do anything, but my body was paralyzed with fear. I couldn't take my eyes off them, those black, soulless eyes that seemed to bore into me, sucking the life out of the room, out of me. The girl took a step closer, her smile widening, the darkness in her eyes spreading, consuming. The boy remained seated, but his gaze was locked on me, and I could feel something, some unseen force, pushing down on me, suffocating me. "Please," I choked out, "just leave." The girl laughed, a sound that was far too deep, too sinister for a child. It echoed in the small cabin, reverberating off the walls, and with it came a wave of darkness that seemed to swallow the light. "We can't leave," the girl said, her voice echoing with that same darkness. "Not until we're finished." "Finished with what?" I stammered, terror clawing at my chest. The girl didn't answer. Instead, she reached out, her hand cold as ice as it touched my arm. The moment her skin made contact with mine, a jolt of pain shot through me like a bolt of electricity. I gasped, trying to pull away, but her grip was like iron. "We're hungry," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. "So very hungry." And then everything went black. I don't know how long I was out, but when I came to, I was lying on the floor of the cabin, the cold seeping into my bones. The fire had gone out, the room plunged into darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon filtering through the window. I tried to move, but my body felt heavy, sluggish, like all the energy had been drained from me. My head was pounding, my vision blurry. I blinked, trying to focus, and that's when I saw them. The kids were still there, standing over me, their eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. But something was different about them now. Their faces seemed older, more twisted, like they had aged years in the span of minutes. The innocence that had initially masked their true nature was completely gone, replaced by something much darker, much more malevolent. "You're awake," the girl said, her voice now a low, guttural growl. I tried to push myself up, but I couldn't. It was like something was holding me down, pinning me to the floor. "Let me go," I croaked, my voice barely above a whisper. The boy stepped closer, his face inches from mine. The coldness radiating from him was overwhelming, and I could feel the life draining out of me, being pulled away by some unseen force. "We're not done yet," the boy hissed, his breath freezing against my skin. I felt panic rising in my chest, my mind racing as I tried to think of a way out. I had to get out of here, had to get away from them. But my body refused to cooperate. It was like they had sapped all the strength from me, leaving me weak and helpless. The girl knelt beside me, her hand resting on my chest. The coldness of her touch seeped into my skin, into my bones, and I could feel the darkness spreading, consuming. "We'll be finished soon," she said, her voice barely human. "Just a little longer." And then they began to chant. It was a low, rhythmic sound, like an incantation in a language I couldn't understand. The words were dark and twisted, each syllable sending a wave of terror through me. The chant grew louder, the words reverberating through the cabin like the tolling of a death knell. It was as if the very walls were absorbing the darkness, the shadows twisting and writhing like living things. The children's voices, though still monotonous, seemed to echo from every corner of the room, filling it with an oppressive sense of doom. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. The weight on my chest was unbearable, as if the air itself had turned against me, pressing down with invisible hands. My vision began to blur, darkness creeping in at the edges as the chanting reached a fever pitch. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, a void that seemed to swallow all hope. I felt a brief surge of relief, but it was quickly replaced by a deep, primal fear. The children were no longer standing over me. They had moved back to the couch, their black eyes locked on mine. The girl's face was twisted into a cruel smile, and the boy's expression was one of pure malevolence. "It's done," the girl said, her voice echoing in the silence. "We've fed." "Fed?" I croaked, struggling to understand what she meant. "What did you do to me?" The boy leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. We took what we needed. You're lucky we didn't take more. I didn't know what they meant, but I could feel it. Something vital had been drained from me, something more than just physical strength. It was like they had taken a piece of my soul, leaving me hollow and empty. The girl tilted her head, studying me with those dark, soulless eyes. You'll feel weak for a while, but you'll live. Most don't. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to ask what she meant by that, but I was too afraid of the answer. Instead, I forced myself to sit up, every movement a struggle. The room seemed to spin around me, the darkness pressing in from all sides. Why? I finally managed to ask. Why are you doing this? The girl's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. Because we can. Because we need to. And because you let us in. Those last words hit me like a punch to the gut. I had let them in. I had invited this horror into my home, and now I was paying the price. I had heard stories of black-eyed children before, but I had never believed them. I thought they were just urban legends, tales to scare kids around the campfire. But now I was living the nightmare, and I realized too late that the stories were true. The boy stood up from the couch, his movements eerily smooth and fluid. He walked over to the door, his hand resting on the doorknob. We'll be going now, he said, his voice calm and cold. But remember, we'll always be watching. The girl followed him, pausing at the door to give me one last look. You should be more careful who you let in, she said, her voice dripping with malice. Not everyone is as merciful as we are. With that, they turned and walked out into the night, the door closing softly behind them. The moment they were gone, the weight on my chest lifted and I could breathe again. I collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. I don't know how long I lay there, but eventually I forced myself to get up. The cabin was dark, the fire long since extinguished. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon through the windows, casting eerie shadows across the room. I stumbled to the door, my legs barely supporting me. I had to make sure they were really gone, that this wasn't some cruel trick. I opened the door and looked out into the night. The forest was silent, the wind had died down, and there was no sign of the children. But the air still felt heavy, tainted by their presence. I could feel it in my bones, a lingering darkness that refused to leave. I closed the door and locked it, my hands shaking. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I saw their faces, those black, soulless eyes staring back at me. The next morning, I packed my things and left the cabin. I didn't bother telling my uncle what had happened. What could I say? That I had invited something evil into his home? That I had barely escaped with my life, or whatever was left of it. I drove back to the city, but I couldn't escape the feeling that they were still out there, watching, waiting. I've tried to move on, to forget what happened, but it's impossible. The memory of that night haunts me, the darkness they brought into my life clinging to me like a shadow. I've since learned that encounters with black-eyed children often end badly. People disappear, or worse, they become hollow shells of their former selves, lost to whatever dark force these children serve. I don't know why I was spared, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over, that they're not done with me. So, I'm writing this as a warning. If you ever hear a knock at your door late at night and you look out and see children with black eyes, don't let them in. No matter what they say, no matter how much they plead, don't open that door. Because once you let them in, they'll take something from you, something you can never get back. And if you're lucky, that's all they'll take. Weeks have passed since that night, but the terror hasn't faded. In fact, it's grown worse. At first, I thought I could move on, push it to the back of my mind and pretend it was just a bad dream. But the more I try to forget, the stronger the memories become. I started seeing them again. Not in person, thank God, but in my dreams. Every night, without fail, I find myself back in that cabin, the fire crackling, the wind howling outside. The door knocks, and I'm filled with that same sense of dread, knowing what's on the other side. In my dreams, I try to resist. I try to keep the door shut, but I always fail. The compulsion is too strong, the voice is too persuasive. The door swings open, and there they are, those black-eyed children, smiling that twisted smile, their cold hands reaching out for me. I wake up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding, but the fear doesn't end when I open my eyes. It lingers, a constant presence, gnawing at the edges of my sanity. I've started avoiding mirrors because every time I catch a glimpse of myself, I see something in my eyes. Something dark, something that wasn't there before. I'm not the same person I was before that night. I feel like a part of me is missing, like they took something vital from me when they were in that cabin. I'm more irritable, more paranoid, always looking over my shoulder, expecting to see them standing there, watching, waiting. I've tried to tell myself it's just my imagination, that the encounter left me traumatized and that's why I'm seeing things. But deep down, I know it's more than that. I know they did something to me, something that's still affecting me. I've done more research trying to find answers, but all I've found are more stories, more warnings. People who encountered black-eyed children and lived to tell about it are few and far between. And those who do are never the same. Some of them go mad, others disappear, and some, like me, are left haunted by the experience. I've started hearing the knocking again. Not just in my dreams but in real life. It's always late at night, always the same 3 knocks, slow and deliberate. I'll go to the door knowing I shouldn't, but unable to resist. I'll look through the peephole and there's no one there. But I know they're out there. I can feel them. And every time I hear that knocking, I'm filled with the same terror I felt that night in the cabin. It's like they're toying with me, reminding me that they're not done with me. I don't know what they want, but I'm afraid to find out. I've considered leaving, moving far away, but something tells me it wouldn't matter. They'll find me no matter where I go. They're not bound by the same rules as we are. Once you've let them in, they're a part of you and there's no escaping them. I'm writing this because I don't know how much longer I can take it. I'm losing sleep, I'm losing my mind, and I don't know how to make it stop. The fear is eating away at me, and I'm starting to wonder if that's what they wanted all along. So please, if you're reading this, heed my warning. Don't make the same mistake I did. If they come to your door, no matter how innocent they seem, no matter how much they beg, don't let them in. Because once you do, they'll never really leave. And neither will the darkness.